Hi, everyone. Welcome to Guardians of the Virtual Realm of Fraud, Fortifying against AI-powered cybersecurity. My name is Kennedy Meda. I'm the Director of Digital Safety and Fraud Solutions here at Centific. So I'll be moderating today's panel. We have a lot of heavy hitters today on the panel, but the main focus is going to be trying to gain an understanding or gain insights from some of the folks on the panel on how complex it can be as it pertains to cybersecurity, how cybersecurity is leading towards fraud, and then just AI driven elements pertaining to cybersecurity and fraud. So what I'll do is go through each one individually, just to have you guys introduce yourselves and maybe speak on your background. And then I'll ask a follow-up question to each individual person after you give your background. So I'll start with Scott. Scott, go ahead and just introduce yourself, explain your background, and then I'll ask a follow-up question.
Well, great. Thank you, everyone. Kennedy, can you hear me? Do you see me okay?
Yes.
You see the big smile on my face?
Yes.
That's because I am retired from the FBI. And I retired 6.5 years ago in 2018 when the FBI was only in the news once a month. And if anyone here in the chat wants to ask me some tough questions, it's okay, because my 89-year-old mother from Brooklyn asks me every day, and I'm going to tell her the same thing I tell you. Mom, and I'm going to treat everyone like family. Listen, I get a great pension once a month, so just let it go, okay? Number one question I get all the time is, do I miss the FBI? And unfortunately, I say no right away. And I had an amazing 30-year career. Started when I was 20 years old in 1988 in New York. I see Samantha is from Bensonhurst. I'm from Coney Island, a couple of areas over. I always go to Bensonhurst for my bagels. Got a job with the FBI at age 20 years old, became an agent in 1995, worked cyber in 97, got sucked into it because I was the only agent in the office who knew how to use America Online. It wasn't the cool, fun, sexy job to have, but the FBI got involved in cybercrime in 1998, almost, was that 26 years ago, because of critical infrastructure protection. So when people say to me, Scott, how come the government's not doing enough about cybercrime? We've been involved with this for 26 years. The FBI formed a cyber division at headquarters in 2002. I went down to DC in 2003 to work on the national cyber strategy. All my friends told me I was committing career suicide because the cybercrime problem would go away by 2007, which it hasn't, as we all see. Stayed in Nashville, Tennessee with the FBI until 2018. I was the supervisor of the FBI cybercrime squad. During my decades with the FBI, I dealt with thousands of victims. And a couple of things I really want to talk about today is some of the commonalities that we're seeing in cybercrime, how the problem has really stayed the same, how simple it is for the bad guys to do damage to our lives, not only us, our organizations, our family, and our kids. And, when I retired in 2018, I didn't think the problem can get any worse. I thought we were at ground zero. And now the problem has gotten so much worse, and it continues to get worse despite all the money that we've been spending on the issue. So I am excited here to be with this panel, to really dive into it with one goal here today, and that's to really help you reduce your chances of becoming the next cybercrime victim.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. And just a follow-up question. What do you think some of the most significant challenges you've observed in the cybersecurity landscape as it pertains to threats just over the years? You did mention cybersecurity, how it started or originated within the FBI. So just your overall thoughts on the landscape and the changes over the years.
The level of how simple it is for a cyber criminal to get access to ruin our lives, to me, is amazing. And that's what most people don't realize, is that it is so easy today, also in the world of fraud, because from where I come from, it's stayed the same. It's all about social engineering.
Right.
And what is social engineering? Tricking us into doing things we normally would do. But now, as organizations continue to spend more and more money on enterprise level solutions, the bad guys are just starting to go after the end users. And so many of us here, and let me know your thoughts in the chat. I mean, so many of us have to keep our kids safe from the sextortion issues and the online predators, which isn't stopping. And at the same time, the elder fraud continues. I just dealt with a victim who lost almost $6 million in a cryptocurrency investing scam. And, and most of it could have been prevented.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Scott. And we have Brian as well. Brian, go ahead and introduce yourself. I know you're, House of Fraud, great at building fraud teams. So how about it?
I'm Brian. I am not retired, and I'm not a part of the FBI. I am still working full-time, and I do not have a pension. But I fell into fraud like a lot of people, one way or another. I actually started in accounting, got way too deep into education before I realized I hate everything about accounting. So if there are people with an accounting background or with an accounting and still hold it true to your heart, I apologize. That's just my experience. But that's where I found fraud originally, kind of studying Enron cases, and I was like, there's something about this of like the investigation side that piqued my interest. I got this piece of paper that said, I'm really, really good at budgeting and nothing to do with fraud. So it took me a little bit of finding a company to hire me. I went to work in e-commerce when I started, which about 10 years ago, if you were in e-commerce, you were a cool startup. I didn't know what that meant. I just thought I wanted it. I also wanted to work in fraud. Again, I didn't know what that meant. And I didn't know what the reality of what that would look like on the professional side. Was the grass just greener and I was just better at accounting, stick with accounting, become a CPA, go that route, the traditional route? Fortunately, I walked into a situation where, I'll admit it today, I didn't really know what I was doing. I was the first fraud hire, and I did something right and solved all their problems almost. They were rejecting almost all the good customers and letting through all the fraudulent customers. So for me, I just walked in and said, hey, we want to let these people in, correct? And we want to block these people, correct? And built profiles around that. And that happened to solve what they're looking for. They're super, super happy. They wanted me to take on more. I needed to reverse engineer what I did and what happened there. Fast forward, that's kind of the environment that I've continued to step into my career of like what Kenny just said. I build fraud teams from scratch. So I take over from companies when they're looking to hire a first fraud hire from a fraud by committee. So a whole bunch of people that ended up with the responsibilities of fighting and investigating fraud that said, I want nothing to do with this. Get this off my plate yesterday. So a lot of my career and upbringing of what I was taught is from people who wanted nothing to do with fraud. So I wasn't really sure if what I was doing was even right. I'm learning from people who aren't experts. That's really the foundation of my career. So this kind of spent into two prongs of one nuance to me is instead of focusing in the financial services or marketplaces, I like to see how different business models are abused by fraud. So it's brought me from digital subscriptions, physical goods, marketplaces, fintechs. I had a little consulting time because of a little hiccup in contract with the company, conversation for another day, which naturally brings me today to the vendor side, the dark side. I joined a startup, fraud orchestration platform, to help them build it out and make a product and sell it to people just like me. I built out a similar type of platform at my previous role. So it kind of made sense. Through a lot of that, I've been creating content. If you want to call me a LinkedIn influencer, a thought leader, good words, bad words, and anything in between. One thing I chose to do is put myself out there and share some of my journeys and the obstacles without there. Kind of speaking to myself of learning from non-fraud experts. And it happened to be a little bit relevant of other people going through this. Of I don't really know how to get people to buy in and support. Like I know how to investigate, but how do I actually build a successful career in this space? So that's ultimately what has led to running the House of Fraud. So it's a community for fraud experts, helping them build a successful career together.
Thank you, Brian. And just a follow-up question. What key strategies do you employ when you're organizing and building a successful fraud team from the ground up?
Step one is understand who I'm taking over. What have they done? It gives me the understanding of what do they really care about? What are going to be my quick wins? Do they really care about identity at the front door? Do they really care about money movement? And get a lay of the land. What really is the risk surface area of the company? What really is driving impact? What do we have visibility to today? What do I not really know but could be a problem, but I need to figure out how to solve? And that's really where I'm starting of understanding who the hierarchy of politics is ultimately what I call it, of understanding who's who really cares, who's going to really make movements, who do I need to align with? And then that will start to give me the understanding of how to build my strategies to align with the bigger mission of the company, which then will trickle down into, all right, we really care about our chargeback rate and money movement, or we really care about the front door and ATOs. So it kind of depends on that, and that'll ultimately dictate how I'm thinking about building it out. Keep in mind, when I'm joining earlier stage companies, it's not really a built out structure. So I'm kind of starting to build the foundation and take over from what they have. They might have nothing. They might have a single platform set up with default settings, causing a lot of friction. So I start with who's who in the company. I look at kind of our baseline metrics of what I have visibility today as like a standard. Those two kind of give me the idea of what goals I'm shooting and aiming for. And then I look at who's complaining about us. Social media, in our customer management system, what are they complaining about? Are they complaining my account is hacked? Are they complaining about you keep rejecting my card? These can give me themes of what I might need to look a little bit deeper into to understand, is there really a problem, or are these one-off situations, and what is it costing our business today? And then lining up my own prioritization of what problem needs to be solved today and what problem can be solved tomorrow.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Wow. And Ritesh, feel free to introduce yourself, your background. Definitely know you have a very strong background in the engineering space, building at those systems. So feel free to give us insights.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Hi. Thanks for giving me the opportunity. I'm Ritesh Mohan. I've been working in the fraud detection area since the last 16 years. I graduated with, did my undergrad with instrumentation and control engineering, and then out of my college I started to develop voice applications. Didn't find my calling in there, and then I was given an assignment to implement fraud detection system for wires and bill payments. Those were the times when we had legacy systems, very rule based and static threshold based systems. So I realized that the principles are basically the same of what I learned, where engineering, you apply some rules, you see the feedback, and then you make corrections and then apply more new rules. So that's probably one of the principles in which fraud systems also work. And so I started with there, and then I found it to be very interesting, and I persisted in this area. And today I designed the technical architecture of fraud systems. I've worked in the consumer space and also in the merchant services space. So all the banking transactions, credit card, debit card, your login events, how the users interact with the system. So the biggest thing about detecting fraud is to know your good user. So once you know your good user, once you know more about your user, then you can profile the user and detect suspicious activity. So between you and the fraudster, whoever knows your user well wins. So yeah, so that has been one of the principles of working in the architecting the fraud systems.
Okay, thank you, Ritesh. And just a follow-up question. So when it comes to building out and even integrating detection systems across multiple platforms enterprise-wide within an organization, do you find there to be some difficulties due to some of the cyber threats going on and the drive of AI associated with that?
Yeah, when we had legacy systems, let's start from there. They were very rule-based and static threshold-based systems. So the fraudsters started to get more and more intelligent, and they started to send automated fraud inquiries on your system, and they were able to predict your thresholds, and they were able to happily work under your threshold. Now with the emergence of AI, it's much more advanced for them. So they can very well predict what is going to be your fraud strategy and work within that. So that is a big challenge. Now, when we detect fraud in a payment transaction, it starts from, say, when you swipe a card at a merchant location, and the transaction goes to the acquirer, then it goes to the network, and then you have your issuing organization study the suspicious activity in the transaction. So at every level, we have to detect fraud. The biggest challenge is to correlate all the data generated in different stages. Also correlate the behavioral analytics of your user. So we get all this data, but an efficient system is the one which has all this data available in the right time to detect fraud in line instead of doing it post facto.
Well, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ritesh. And Alex, we have Alex, fraud expert, founder of the Disputes Defense Consulting. Alex, feel free to dive deeper into your background, and then I'll have a follow-up question for you.
Sure. First of all, thank you guys for having me. To everybody else, my name is Alexander Hall. I'm the founder of Dispute Defense Consulting. With Dispute Defense, I focus on helping various clients, whether it's a financial institution, merchant, marketplace, or fellow service providers, in several capacities, all centered around fraud strategy. How do we use the tech? How do we use the data? How do we best prepare for what's coming down the line? And how do we best use historical performance to project into the future what might be happening? As for my experience, I have 17 years of fraud-related experience, but unlike these guys, we used to butt heads. I was on the other side. I was a fraudster for 10 years. During that time, I developed fraud methodologies and specialized in what I call multi-system exploits. So to break that down a little bit, if we look at payment fraud, you see compromised payment details being used on a merchant platform. The transaction goes through, the order gets shipped, and they get the thing. I call that linear methods. You got the information, you copied and pasted it into a form. You go up from there and you start talking about ATOs. Simply taking over an established account doesn't have much value. You still need to transact, or the fraudster still needs to transact in order to extract some value from the methods. So then they move over and they start doing other things after they ATO the account. They start doing other things. I call that multi-touch methods. The last one is where I used to live, which is called multi-system exploits. What I specialized in was the injection of poison data into aggregated data sets that would then be used downstream and seen as reliable by the target platform. So an example of this in today's world is like synthetic ID fraud. When somebody takes disparate data points and they begin to assign superficial PII to those data sets in order to make them seem reliable, in order to go transact or exploit a different platform, whether it's financial institutions or subprime lenders, things like that. That would be an example of the type of methods I used. So that ran for a while. I was never busted. I was never caught. It was the birth of my daughter that made me realize that I had something to live for, and that's when I changed my life. Lied through my teeth to get a job as a fraud analyst at a vape company. Proved that I could fight fraud. I figured out how to use my skills for good. So I did well there, became the head of fraud, overseeing 3 divisions: wholesale, retail, drop shipping. And And it was at that point, now that I reflect, it was at that point that I learned the value in juggling fraud strategies. Every strategy is comprised of data, technology, personnel, policies, and procedures. And I learned that in juggling all of this is the only way that we're going to get ahead of the fraudsters. In 2020, COVID hit, layoffs happened, and I used my unemployment to start dispute defense. And I have since been working primarily with solution providers. So the transaction analysis companies, the PII companies, the KYC companies, everybody that gets hired by the merchants and the financial institutions. I've been working primarily with them regarding product development, marketing and thought leadership, training and things like that. And then as of 2024, I have pivoted to work directly with merchants and financial institutions with things like training, strategy development. One use case that I get contacted about quite often is untangling this weave of technology and data. For anybody in the space, you're probably very familiar that we have this very reactive whack-a-mole approach where a problem comes up and we solve it with some tech, and then another problem comes up, we solve it with some tech, and another problem, solve it with some tech. A lot of the conversations I have are centered around getting that organized, reorganized, maybe figuring out what data and what tech is overstretched or underutilized, cleaning it all up. That seems to be the most called for engagement that I participate in. And yeah, so 10 years on the other side, 7 years here. Great meeting all these amazing people, all these brilliant minds, and that's me.
Thank you, Alex. And a follow-up question that should be interesting, since you were both on the fraudster and now the fraud fighter side. What are some low friction fraud strategies you would suggest maybe organizations to implement to better enhance customer verification or customer identification, but also keeping the customer satisfied as well?
What I feel is really great is actually what Ritesh touched on, is behavioral analytics. I feel that from the highest level, the most effective data and technology to use would be data and technology that supports behavioral analytics. Now, there's some misnomers about behavioral. Typically, when people hear behavioral, they think about Alt-Tab and copy and paste and velocity, and that's very much centered in bot detection and bad behavior that's pretty obvious. However, under the umbrella of behavioral analytics is geolocation. As Ritesh said, spending behaviors. How are these payments being used? When are they being used? What's the velocity of the payments? Then there's device intelligence. If somebody accesses from this device, but 30 minutes later is on another device that has not been registered within our ecosystem, well, that's a behavior that we can glean from that data, and it can be valuable. So the reason why I say that it's important is two-part. One, with my very specific experience, I know that if somebody requests something of a fraudster, the fraudster will provide it, whether that's PII information, an email and password combination, social security number, date of birth. Then you go up to passwords and usernames, password and email combinations. Then we go up to facial biometrics and voice biometrics. Whatever we request of a user, the fraudster will absolutely provide. In the case of passive data sets like behavioral analytics, device intelligence, so forth down that tree, we aren't making a request. There isn't this Trojan horse dynamic that a fraudster can put together manipulated information and then submit it across. Because of that, the fraudsters, especially in a layered approach, fraudsters are going to be hard pressed to reverse engineer the determination processes that we have in place on the back end. So that's one. Two, it's low friction. It's passive. Our good users can interact with the platform, and if we are heavily anchored to these, especially in the case of established accounts, new accounts require something else. But for established accounts, the users just interact, and their simple interaction with our platform is verifying that they are who they claim to be and that they should have access to what they should have access to. So my response to you for low friction, definitely behavioral analytics comprised of things like geolocation, device intelligence, transaction monitoring, passive transaction monitoring, and things like that.
Perfect, thank you. And I'll throw out a question. We'll just go around. So I'll start with Brian, then Alex, Scott, and Ritesh. And So the first question that I'm going to throw out is how do you train and educate your staff to stay ahead of the latest AI-powered fraud threats? So I'll just start with Brian.
I call it time tax. So there always has to be a balance of how much time in your day can you allocate to something emerging, happening soon. If you allocate 100% of your time, you're going to be fired because you're not doing your job at hand today. But if you only focus heads down on what your problem is today, a quarter, 2 quarters, 3 quarters, a year from now, that next big wave, you're going to be unprepared. No strategies, no internal education, no idea what tools out there could help you, not help you. Do you have data today that you could just use to cover 65% of the gap versus 100%, so you don't need to invest in anything else? If you don't have an understanding of what is to come, it's very hard to prepare for or build out any plan. You might determine, hey, we don't need to consider thinking about this for a quarter, 2 quarters, but that's because you put a little bit of investment of understanding what is out there, what companies, and this can come from a couple different ways. It can come from spammy marketing tactics of what companies are trying to position and brand themselves today as. It can come from news articles, blogs, what's happening covered by major publications and news. It can come from what you're seeing or companies you want to grow into be, what they're kind of really focused on today. Usually, if you're kind of growing into a specific company, what's being tested at those companies you'll see it small scale and see it is happening on our platform, but we're detecting it or not. So now the question is, what percentage of time tax? It kind of depends on specific roles. More strategic and balancing you are, you're meeting coverage of your calendars, probably meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting to meeting. So you need to kind of find when you can allocate time to there. If you are frontline more investigator, if you're more task-oriented output, aka review your cases, we need a specific average handling time, we need specific cases to be done, then it becomes like a math problem of when you're able to do it. If you kind of context switch too much, it hurts you there. So right. How I've kind of thought about it is like, if I can invest 15 minutes a day, an hour a week, something like that, of keeping an eye out of what's happening, then that's far more achievable than be like, I'm going to dedicate a week. I'm going to do this. But when you break it up and you're consistently doing it, it's a lot easier to allocate a small percentage of your day or a small percentage of your week to actually get it done. Now, that is how at least I work on figuring out how to dedicate and allocate time to it, sifting through the noise and finding what source and what problems you should really be caring about. That kind of all depends, but I think some other people might have some ideas on that too.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I do agree, breaking it up 15 minutes a day, and it pushes longevity in the long run. So I definitely agree. Alex, what are your thoughts?
It's about consistency. If you're not consistent with anything, right, it's going to fail.
Completely agree.
So I agree completely with Brian. And Brian, you set it up for a great framework to follow. I guess I'll pick it up and talk about kind of the scope of what ongoing education might look like. And so I feel that at least in regards to fraud, if we reflect back on all of the trending methods across any period of time, if we adopt one mindset, we would be able to, at least on a person-by-person basis, we would be able to effectively identify where criminal opportunities exist. So for example, 20, 30 years ago, payment fraud started to take off. Compromised credit card details entered into an e-commerce checkout form. Well, now in the last 18 months, ATOs has come back. Well, that's compromised login details being injected into the login form, or maybe it's social engineering to the customer service. So if you take all of these trends and you try to associate a roadmap to it, what I think is most important for any individual user in a operating within a fraud program on the boots on the ground level, I feel that it is very important for them to understand where they are seated, where they are positioned with regard to the overall roadmap of customer engagements. And so in my trainings, what I try to teach is to identify every touch point, because the truth of the matter is we've identified fraud methods that go into play for every touch point. Think about account creation. Well, they have to create accounts. They use compromised PII to create accounts, and that can become a problem down the line. Then we have ATOs at login. Then we have payment fraud at checkout. Then we have promotion and policy abuse when it comes to, you know, promotions, discounts, things like that at checkout. Then we have customer service and social engineering. Then we have chargebacks and relative chargeback exploits. Had we 10 years ago built this roadmap out proactively without hiring new tech vendors, you know, maybe that comes down the line, but just in our head looked at it this way and identified where we sit, each of us independently, where we sit, and how the story plays out before it makes it to our part and then after it leaves our part. I feel that teams would benefit greatly from gleaning from that, this entire story of the way a user interacts with a platform. So quickly, I would just say, identify the roadmap of your organization, and using the framework that Brian put forward, I would definitely recommend that every agent understand where they sit along that roadmap.
Completely agree. And I think, so Scott, just to touch off of Alex, he mentioned adopting a particular mindset. And for you, I think I want to kind of expand on that. How can we educate when it comes to the organizations, but also have employees internally, you know, adopt a particular mindset, and maybe how will that impact consumers as well for them to adapt that same mindset?
Sure. Yeah, and out of frustration, I created something called the cybersecure mindset, because after being into all my enterprises all had the same issues. They had tons of tech, and they required all of their people to have 30 minutes a year of boring training that didn't relate to anything. So when I get brought into organizations, my whole thing is through the use of storytelling to make you realize that if I can teach you how to keep yourself safe and your family safe, you're going to figure out how to do it at work. If you want to make it fail, just say, hey, we're going to bring an FBI agent here to browbeat you, to tell you how you shouldn't click on links. And that doesn't work. You know, it really doesn't work. It's sitting here. You know, I've touched over 1,000 victims during my career, and what did I discover? Not, you know, and I call it the 4 truths of cybersecurity, that none of my victims ever expected to be a victim. They didn't think they fit the victim profile. Because, you know, at the end of the day, so many organizations cater to, hey, we want to get the enterprise. But the world is made up of small businesses, nonprofit organizations. And just regular end users. That becomes very, very problematic. None of them ever expected to be a victim. When they were victimized and the bad guys got their stuff, they stole the PHI, they stole the data, the intellectual property, they were hit with ransomware. You contact law enforcement. Law enforcement doesn't have a magic wand. There's no reset button. We're not getting the money back. And it's very, very painful when you have to sit down with organizations or even individuals, which I still do every day, and explain to them that I'm sorry you're not getting your money back. And their lives are destroyed. And at the same time, putting these evildoers in jail, or even harder, because the majority of these cybercrime victims are located overseas. They're located in China, Russia, Eastern Europe, all over West Africa. We're seeing cryptocurrency scams coming out of Chinese organized crime, out of countries in Asia that there aren't no laws. And those things are really depressing. But the epiphany that I had during my career is that most of the victimizations could have been prevented if my end users were only armed with a couple of key pieces of information. And I know I'm oversimplifying the problem. And I always sit down and I get brought into organizations. I go, I don't really care what kind of tech you use. You know, it's all doesn't matter. If anyone says to you, I love when they call it solutions, because there's no such thing as a solution. There's always pieces of the puzzle. If 90% of what I dealt with easily could have been prevented, why don't you just do these things? And it's not rocket science. It's nothing I invented. It's not. It's just, and this is what I'd love to talk about a little later. Like, what are the common sense things that if victims would have done would have made themselves so much more secure? And I'll give you a perfect example in the world of banking. All of a sudden, account username password gets compromised. Financial institutions aren't using two-factor authentication. Bad guy gets in, makes withdrawals. And the financial institutions go like this. I can't believe this happened. How did this happen? It was a sophisticated threat actor where it was nothing more than information being picked up on the dark web. So we have to adopt that mindset.
Completely agree. And kind of to bounce onto you, Ritesh, based on what Scott was saying, he said there's a lot of tech, and honestly, for lack of a better word, really doesn't matter, when it comes to the consumer side. But I want to also include, there was a piece of, there was an article that I read yesterday. It was saying that 80% of data breaches were due to human error. So maybe employee fell asleep, quite frankly, just maybe didn't care and clicked on it. So how do we still, pertaining to the original question, train and educate staff to have a certain, to adopt a certain mindset when it comes to tackling fraud or even just cyber?
Yeah, so for organizations, it's very important to have a security framework and keep updating your employees, keep them trained, keep them feel included in the responsibility of securing your organization and your customers. It's very important for the organizations also to invest in their technology stack, to continuously update their technology stack. Do not use any technology version, any software version for any platform or application software that has any known vulnerability. If you know of it, fix it immediately. Even if you don't need to immediately, but have a roadmap to transition from the legacy kind of systems into the modern cloud-based systems. From a user's perspective, it's also very important to start using the modern ways of payment more. Wallet-based payments are kind of more secure than if you go and swipe your card at a gas station and then get skimmed. So it's important even from users' awareness perspective, and financial organizations should also take this lead to start educating users through ads or whatever on the ATM machines, wherever, to make users utilize the modern ways of payment or modern ways of transacting more.
Thank you. Definitely, I definitely agree with that. And I'll bounce this next question off of you, and then we'll go back up the other way. So, Scott and Alex, Brian mentioned some key points. So let's say an organization has the best system. We know, systems won't necessarily prevent fraud or cybersecurity, but how do we, I guess, help the consumers that are utilizing the organization to trust us with their finances? How do we help them not become victims, regardless of how the systems that we may have? How do we assist with that?
So for the organizations to have this kind of insurance, right, for their users, right, it is important that they create like a system where there is anyone can go in and file claim with ease, dispute a transaction with ease. And when there is a claim filed or a transaction is disputed, it is on the organization, financial organization, to do the proper due diligence, going back and forth with the merchant and the network to understand where the problem was. It causes a lot of frustration sometimes when customers file dispute or file a claim, and the investigation doesn't reach to a point where they can prove it that it was not them who did this transaction. Or also when there are say too many customers being scammed at the same merchant location or in the same zip code, then there's something going on. So there has to be a holistic view that the organizations have to adopt in the claims area as well.
Right. And it seems like based on what you're saying, it's utilizing data. So Scott, do you think understanding the data that organizations have, do you think that would help prevent a lot of the fraud that we're seeing associated to cyber attacks? Maybe utilizing AI to go through the data to understand why people are actually victims and try to understand how to help them.
No, I'm going to take a different approach on that, because I've been dealing with banks since 2000. I've been dealing with banks since the beginning of my career, and banks are in the reactive mode. No offense, Ritesh. I love BOA. I've dealt with you guys on the business email compromise and your fraud stuff, first class in the world. But, however, the banks do an amazing job of pushing the liability down to the consumer. I mean, the banks aren't victims at all. The consumers are the victims. And let's just take one instance here, the business email compromise. You know, something that is impacting organizations all over the world because someone's not using two-factor authentication in the chain. There's no policies up in place. So let me just give you, doesn't matter how much data we have, we just got to drill down to the most basic, simple levels here. Have a victim, company here, billion-dollar company, has the best tools, the best trainings, a chief information security officer, but they have an invoice that they need to pay. And that invoice is sent over email. And all of a sudden, everybody knows the email's coming. So the email comes, and all of a sudden it says, hey, here's your invoice, $3.5 million invoice. 15 minutes later, on that same exact chain, because the bad guy compromised the third-party vendor, said, hey, we just want to let you know we made a mistake with your invoice. We overcharged you by 3%. So what do you think the accounts payable person does? She goes, hey, this is awesome. All right, this is great. But she can't. There's a system, the company has a separation of duties. At least they're doing something right. Internal audit looks at it, but nobody makes this out to see that they changed bank account and routing information. Okay? So now it gets signed off by the CFO. The victim company sends the wire transfer to the bank in the amount of $3.5 million. The bank, which does a great job in protecting and preventing fraud, picks up the phone, calls the company. And I'll ask you, Ritesh, what do you think happens? The bank picks up the phone, calls the CFO, and says to the CFO, are you sure you'd like to make this $3.5 million wire transfer? And what do you think the CFO says? Of course. Absolutely. Of course we want to do it. So now they send the money out. The money ends up 10 days later, the vendor calls, says, where's my money? I don't know. Where is it? Where? It goes back and forth. The money's sent to the United Arab Emirates. It's a multinational company. Okay, no big deal. Everybody starts pointing fingers at everyone else. The bank says, hey, we sent the money exactly where you told us to. We even picked up the phone and called the CFO. So the CFO goes down and down. This was one of the situations where I was able to work with the foreign government, and I was able to recover $600,000. It's never a good day when I go like this. Hey, you didn't lose 3.5 million. You only lost 2.9. So these things happen every single day. And whose responsibility is it to educate companies? Everyone's pointing the fingers at each other. And they all go like this. We don't have time for education.
Thank you, Scott. And just to bounce off of what you were saying, not having time for education, but also the banks are, for the most part, bringing the liability down, to the consumer. The bank isn't, the victim; it's the actual consumer. So, Alex, what are your overall thoughts on that? Do you think it's easy for fraud or even AI-driven fraud attacks to happen because of the lack of understanding from the consumer, and then also the liability being shipped away from the banks?
Yes. So exactly what your question is something I've done a tour on this exact topic, and what I call it is the perfect financial crime storm, which isn't a sexy name, but the idea is there. And it's comprised of 3 different elements. If we look at fraud by majority, by volume, we will see that the majority of it is payment fraud. Credit cards, checks, something against merchants. Those are the ones that by volume are encountering the majority of the losses, at least by number of attempts. If we accept that, that's one aspect. That dynamic is slowly changing. Well, it will quickly change, but we're seeing it start now, where fraudsters are shifting over into identity-related fraud. So that's what we've identified as identity theft 30 years ago. Now we have synthetics, and then there's another trademarked term for another type of synthetic fraud that is going to essentially, it's where I used to live. This is what I used to do. And so the idea was this, remember how before I said synthetic IDs were predicated on disparate data points, where you have the SSN, the DOB, and the name that are unassociated, the bringing it together and then packing it with superficial PII to meet the requirements of subprime lenders. Well, what I used to do was one step above that, and what it was to take related data points, a true SSN, DOB name, a real person, and inject inject other superficial PII into it in order to downstream make it be effective. The problem is this: as that PII is being injected to that target profile, it begins to look good to the financial institutions. It begins to look good to the financial institutions, and then any payment instruments that are established through the FI can then be used with full discretion at any merchant down the line. And there won't be any chargebacks being reported there because the fraudster is the one controlling the accounts. I see this, and I see this happening in the next 6 to 18 months being a huge shift of the entirety of fraud moving from payment fraud into identity-related fraud. And the way I look at it is this: if I have compromised payment details, where am I using them? Where am I going to transact with them? Merchants. If I have compromised identity details, especially when you consider the availability of it in the criminal marketplace, all these breaches and everything like that, and you also consider that every identity with high credit viability is worth infinitely more than a compromised credit card, where do they go to type in those compromised identity details? Financial institutions. Now, here's the problem, to tie it back to what Scott was saying. These victims now, the real PII profile, the real identity profile that exists there, what happens when that person does get through this? The bank stops it, flags it as fraud, and then they go 6 months later to get a new lease. Are they flagged for fraud when they're really using their identity information? When they go and get a loan, when they have some cataclysmic issue somewhere and have to qualify for a credit card to do a thing, any number of these things where identity information is being transacted down the line, how are they going to be treated? So fraudsters leveraging identity information, the availability or predicated on the availability of compromised identity information, Ritesh, the unpreparedness of financial institutions to respond to this, the lack of education overall, the liability being shifted down the line. All of these are huge concerns for me. And it's just true. We aren't ready. And then to bring AI into it.
Right.
I say that you can only automate what you can reliably predict. Okay, because you don't want to go wild and start to automate stuff that you don't understand and that you can't, put into a box. So when it comes to fraudsters leveraging AI, I'll just tell you, what I used to do is I used to order a catalog from Guitar Center, from some boutique spot, from Sweetwater Music. And that would effectively assign a new shipping address or a new physical address to this identity set. AI can do that in 2 seconds. Okay, well then how do we get a new phone number? Sign up for a newsletter and add that phone number. Sign up for a new email address from another newsletter. Get scammy accounts and all these different things. Sign up for all these superficial data points. And then what the fraudster, what I had effectively accomplished was to poison the data lake that is being relied upon by so many different platforms, whether it's FIs or merchants, marketplaces, whoever, insurance companies, whoever. When it comes to AI, what took me only 5 minutes per target profile can now all of it be done in 30 seconds in the hands of a fraudster. AI is wildly powerful for automation. Now, fast forward to the fraud prevention side, and again, the same rule applies. We can only automate what we can reliably predict. And so we need to extend our scope. We need to understand what the data provides to us, what the story is, and what the story might be, and build data.
Right. And I completely agree with that. And Brian, to kind of segue to you, how do we now, since your specialty is building robust fraud teams, how do we now take everything that all the folks here have said and implement that when we're building a fraud team from the ground up, with keeping in mind AI as well? Mute button, unmute. Uh-oh. Well, I will say while we're waiting for Brian, Ritesh, you are taking a beating here for the financial institutions.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I switched headphones, something happened, and I lost it. So can you repeat the question? I got distracted by clicking the unmute button and then
no problem. Yeah, so just based on what everyone was saying, and even piggybacking off of Alex, when it comes to AI even driving things, like he said, that would take normally 5 minutes into seconds. How do we, I guess, educate fraud teams, since your background is strongly into building fraud teams? How do we kind of strategize that as you build a robust fraud team?
Again, this kind of goes into understanding like what my fraud problems are today. And if I'm seeing new accounts created, does the activities seem to be manual or automated? And this is where we can start to break it down of like what breadcrumbs are being left behind. And these breadcrumbs are specific data points that might give us a hint that it is coming from Gen AI or not. So one example that, not Gen AI related, but my experience of like document verification, we'd be able to look at documents being submitted for new applications for a business bank account at a company I worked at. And I learned this from one individual. So this person is the smartest person I've ever met when it comes to document verification. I'll recommend this person 100 times over. You want to learn anything about identifying fraudulent documents. So this one, kind of like going into all the different boldness of lines in small little areas, fonts, and just seeing if like the background and what to actually look for and how to really zoom in super quickly, all the way to metadata. And metadata is a clear and obvious one where like if the timestamps are the same, created and downloaded are the same, then there's not really time to manipulate there. If the created here and edited another time and it had a log of Photoshop, there's no reason for that to be there. That's a breadcrumb. So what I'm looking for is different breadcrumbs along the way of as I am learning of what activity actually happens on my platform, of what is really there. So kind of what Alexander said of like, if I'm seeing this type of fraud, can it be scaled up 10x? What would it look like if it was a little bit cleaner? What would it look like if it was it? And I'm kind of going through that game of kind of learning what is possible. And now I need to confirm or deny my hypothesis. Is it actually happening on the platform? Is it even possible? So then I'm looking to confirm this in it. So this is a reactive state. what I just walked through is absolutely a reactive state. Some companies call it buying data. I'm buying fraudulent data of activity happening on my platform so I can confirm my hypothesis that this is happening, but we want to build something before it gets too bad. What scares me the most, and I break it up into this, there's different levels. What Alexander talked about of his multi-system exploitation is very intensive, takes a lot of effort and a lot of patience. That's why you can have a high risk and a high return for that type of fraud and abuse. Harder to scale. Can you scale it faster now, today? Yes. But for me, I break that down into level 3. So now as we go down each level, it becomes easier to scale. Level 1 kind of being text messages, emails, like the old playbook was look for spelling mistakes, bad grammar, weird formatting, like all of that is thrown out the window now. That's level 1 though. Think about how, like, if you think about models, you're probably thinking OpenAI and some of the other ones closely associated to that. What do you go for? Hey, help me write this post, help me edit this. Like, that's level 1 of prompt engineering. As you get more complex up to that, it would be like helping me edit images, supplying documentation. I give you this device ID, help me edit it through. Hopefully some of these have been red teamed a little bit, so you need to jailbreak it a little bit or use a jailbroken model that is out there to be able to manipulate that. Then again, I'm looking for those breadcrumbs. When those are uploaded and something comes back and I'm buying data, what breadcrumbs were left behind? To level 3 of what Alexander kind of laid out, takes patience, takes time. Even at a scaled and automation bit, it still takes time for credit hits to come through, to build a business credit profile. You're not going to deploy that today and then attack today. You might be attacking a batch set of what was created 6-12 months ago. So the more patient a criminal is in building out these schemes, the harder they are to detect, the more legitimate they look. So it comes between the balance of patience and scale to me. That's what scares me the most, and that's what I'm kind of focusing on today, of like, who is being really, really patient today, and what will that look like when they choose to attack in 12 months?
All right, thank you, Brian. And we have, we're actually at time, it's 2:59. I'm not sure if the live stream will just close out, but if everyone has time, I just wanted to give everyone at least 30 seconds. Oh, we're at 3 o'clock. 30 seconds just to give their overall thoughts, if possible. So I'll start with Brian.
I can lead because I do have to.
Okay.
This one. So there's kind of a couple pillars for me. One is understanding your risk surface area. Like, what are you responsible in your scope today? Like, for you to not get fired to do your job well, what are you responsible for today? What will that look like tomorrow? Tomorrow can be any time in the future, but tomorrow in general. And that kind of gives the balance of what things are looking like. A lot of AI right now, we're unsure of how we'll shift, what restrictions will be put in place. Will some of the jailbroken models and tools be shut down? What does it look like when patients? So for me, there's a lot of unknown, and there's a lot of shiny object syndrome of people trying to sell maybe snake oil into helping protect and to detect it today. So really, this is where the time tax comes in, of doing your research, of understanding what it will really could look like on your platform. Put out a hypothesis today, just kind of like, hey, what does it look like? What do I think it looks like? And then kind of see how that tracks over time as you're learning and improving. But for me, it starts with understanding the attack surface area of your business and different vulnerabilities of that. For me, my focus is fraud related. So I'm more thinking selfishly in that lens. And then I know, Scott, you think about it in a different lens and a greater lens. So I think combining that, depending on your scope and role, understand where you sit to really kind of be the best version of yourself.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brian. I know you have to go, but thank you for adding some great, I guess, thoughts to some of the questions. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Have a great day. Bye. Alex, 40 seconds for you.
I would probably just piggyback off what Brian said. He gave me a great setup. I feel that the surface area of exposure is definitely important. I think setting up hypothetical suggestions is, number one, the truth of the matter is any vendor or any data that you aggregate from the network is going to act like a crystal ball in two different ways. One, where are the opportunities for technology outside of what you currently have established? So as your company grows, you might be bringing in new tech. You might be changing providers for this and this X, Y, and Z. In business-related practice, not just for fraud prevention, but in business-related practices, a new payment processor, a new BNPL, you might be adopting new practices. So because of that, leveraging the crystal ball that is network data can be extremely powerful. So that's one aspect of just looking and staying up to date on what's happening in the world. But then two, funneling it through your own platform, because the truth of the matter is, and I speak from experience, what the majority of what's being reported today could have been predicted. If everybody had just hypothetically said, hey, we created this form wherein we ask for this information, great. Well, now let's ask, what happens if fraudster A inputs user A's information? How do we validate and verify? And what do we check it against? So there's a framework that I use for that, which is, it breaks down into three pieces. One is validate. If at a form or an interaction we're engaging with somebody, with a user, the first step is always to just say, is the information valid? Well, we've learned
30
across
seconds.
the board. Sorry. Okay, so we've learned across the board that that isn't good enough to validate whether or not the information is correct. The second step is to verify. Is this person who they claim to be, do they have authority to use this information? The third step is to identify intent, which then ties back to behavioral analytics like Ritesh and I were talking about earlier. I feel that evaluating every single one with that in mind will help everyone across the board in identifying AI-driven attacks.
Perfect. Thank you, Alex. Ritesh, do you want to follow up your overall thoughts, especially from the bank standpoint? I know, like I said, getting beat up here.
Yeah. So see, in the days to come, whether people are ready for it or not, AI is going to play a vital role. Banks and any financial institution will have to move towards context-based detection in compared to detection with respect to specific products or with respect to specific transaction. So, and context-based detection would have to be in both ways, with respect to your customer and with respect to fraud activities being observed. Now, AI would play a big role in checking for the fraud activities being injected or being observed at the current moment, because it has access to a lot of data worldwide and can be compared and can do somewhat of a good predictive analysis. And I am sure the models would improve in future, and banks will be empowered.
Thank you, Ritesh. And we'll close out with Scott. Go ahead, 30, 40 seconds.
I'll do it in 20. Keep your family safe. That's all I can say. If you stayed this long, hit me up on LinkedIn. I'll send you a copy of my book. If you're concerned about keeping your family safe, hit me up and I will give you a copy of my book. This is nothing more important than keeping your kids and your parents safe.
I agree. And I'm definitely reaching out for a copy and a signed copy, hopefully. So thank you. Thank you, Scott. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully everyone gained some knowledge or just overall awareness about what's going on in the industry as it pertains to fraud and cyber, and then, of course, AI. But I hope everyone has a lovely day off, if you have the day off.
I'm retired. I always have the day off. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, guys.